Story 1.
It all began on that fateful day when he was bitten by a human. Well, human. More like a werewolf. Until then, he had only heard of such creatures from wolves in other packs. Occasionally, he'd catch their scent markings too. But this encounter would be etched in his memory forever, becoming a turning point in his life. Before, he'd been an ordinary wolf, like any other that roamed the nearby forests in abundance. Born a blind pup in a den that had once been home to a badger, he opened his eyes after 2 weeks. At first, he fed on what was regurgitated for him, then on the prey brought to him. He listened to the elders, grew strong, ran with the pack, howled at the moon, courted a she-wolf, hunted, and watched over the pack's young. In short, he lived as any wild animal would, until he crossed paths with that madman. The elders always warned that some beings could change form or shift, as they said. The most well-known were those who came from human villages and resembled wolves. True wolves avoided such pseudo-wolves, and if they were spotted on pack territory, they would organize a fierce defense without delay, and for good reason, often. Werewolves did wolves a serious disservice. Every creature of the forest, conscious of the forest's rhythms, understood that every action had its consequences. Wolves adhered to a code of behavior, staying within certain boundaries unless compelled by necessity. For example, no wolf would attack a human without extreme need. The rare exception might involve an animal too sick or injured to catch its usual prey, finding itself near isolated human dwellings, or a wolf forced to defend its life, territory, or offspring. In other words, a wolf would only attack if extreme need or human actions left it no other choice but to stand its ground. Every wolf knew that humans wouldn't let a wolf attack go unpunished. Hunts would begin. Forests would be combed. Dogs would be released. Hunters would fire their guns, set traps, and dig wolf pits. Who wanted that kind of trouble? But werewolves, as outsiders in the forest, disregarded such restraints. A werewolf, for example, might kill a human without a second thought, then shift forms and go on killing simply for the sake of killing, as long as it posed no risk to him. The plight of ordinary wolves, who would inevitably bear the brunt of human wrath, concerned him the least. Moreover, if a werewolf killed by wolves reverted to human form upon death, it brought about the same problems. This made even such drastic actions perilous, as they could easily create unwanted consequences. And then there was the fact that, by devouring a werewolf, wolves would essentially become both cannibals and man-eaters, harming their psyche and driving them further to consume both humans and their own kind. Additionally, due to his human origin, a werewolf generally stood taller than normal wolves, as his body mass remained unchanged in either form. Where an ordinary wolf might rarely live beyond 15 years, with signs of aging appearing as early as 10, a werewolf's lifespan matched that of a human. And, of course, over those many years, a werewolf would gain considerable experience, further complicating the lives of the forest's native inhabitants. Yet even long experience could not compensate the cleverest werewolf for certain innate knowledge and instincts that only true wolves, born and raised in a real pack, possessed. And everyone knew that a human bitten by a werewolf risked contracting the affliction, transforming into a wolf. But the lycanthrope's nature had two facets, and the principle worked in reverse. A wolf bitten by a werewolf was likely to begin turning into a human. If a bear werewolf had bitten a wolf, perhaps he would have started turning into a bear as well, but such creatures were not found in these parts. Those first days were especially hard. His fur shed, exposing raw pink skin. His tail vanished, retracting into a spine that had undergone other changes as well. His limbs altered form, making normal walking awkward and running outright impossible. His powerful wolf fangs were replaced by weak human teeth. His nose shrank, his sense of smell vanished, along with the rich spectrum of sense that surpassed human capabilities by 40 million times. Losing this primary tool, more crucial even than his keen wolf hearing, which, by the way, also disappeared, was torture in and of itself. But he had to accept the reality and, without complaints or self-pity, learn to use the new capabilities of this unfamiliar body instead of clinging to those he had once known. Yes, on one hand, a creature born a wolf could never fully become a human, even if he resembled one. Just as a human born could never become a true wolf, even if he could change form. Now he was a werewolf, but he had yet to settle into his new role. He had to let go of his old life, however painful it was. He could no longer hunt elk, chase down hares, catch an unwary bird in his jaws, or drive a badger from its den. He could no longer live in the pack and fulfill his place within it. He could no longer be with his maiden pups. He could no longer leave scent marks, for even his smell had changed. That life was over, and there was nothing he could do about it. Yet some things did not change so easily or quickly. For instance, his indomitable wolf spirit, which had allowed him to survive even the most unfavorable circumstances. After all, in difficult times, wolves would eat not just small rodents, but even insects, mushrooms, and berries. Sometimes they'd even raid melon and watermelon patches. Not so much out of hunger, but thirst. When there was a goal, there were always ways to achieve it. Different animals had varied strategies in their fight for survival, and only the outcome could objectively prove the effectiveness of those strategies. Survival of the fittest did not always imply literal physical strength. Any quality that gave an advantage in specific circumstances could enhance the chances of survival. But when the environment changed, that same quality might become useless or even harmful. The appropriateness of survival strategies was never static and depended on numerous factors, relevant or irrelevant at a given moment in a specific situation. People too could overcome difficulties, adapt and survive. Not better or worse than wolves or other creatures, just differently, in their own way. Saying they were weak, pitiful, or insignificant compared to animals was as misguided as trying to pit an elephant against a whale in an abstract contest of strength. A person was not weaker than animals of similar size and weight. While humans might fall short of certain birds in vision sharpness, they exceeded many in reaction speed. Like all creatures, they had their unique strengths, which they used to survive, gain advantages over opponents, and impose their own terms in battles. People built houses, birds built nests, and beavers constructed dams. But one's closeness to nature was not defined by living in a dense forest or a city, but by the ability to retain and effectively use the qualities bestowed by nature. Wandering through his familiar forest, feeling strangely out of place, the werewolf stumbled upon a hunting cabin he would not have approached under other circumstances. Inside, he found clothes, not particularly attractive or well-fitting, but still something he could wear, which he immediately donned following new peculiar habits that had emerged since his transformation. In the loft, he found canned food and a knife to open it. In this regard, people and wolves were somewhat alike. Wolves might kill several prey animals at once, storing food for later, and repeatedly returning to eat what they had saved, while many other predators would disdain such behavior. On the wooden wall hung a photograph of Ernest Hemingway, bearded and in a sweater. The werewolf didn't quite understand who this Hemingway was or what kind of creature a sweater might be. Yet whenever he glanced at an object, words and thoughts about its proper use would surface from deep within his consciousness. The wolf language was a complex thing, as was wolf society itself. Certain parallels with human society provided a foundation that sped up his learning. The wolf language had a vast range of nuances and shades, as varied in tone, timbre, and intonation as, for example, human languages or the languages of bats. Howls, growls, whimpers, barks, snarls, and whines served as tools to convey intricate messages. A wolf, for instance, could communicate the exact location of a specific animal. Capable of sensing another creature from miles away, a wolf conveyed its findings differently when it came across a human, a moose, or something else. One wolf would pass a message along, howling from the lowest note to the highest as a signal. The wolf's choir was an art form learned throughout a lifetime, with many nuances and multiple purposes. It began with the alpha's long howl, ending on a high note, and gradually the rest would join in, following the pack's hierarchy. The voices of the alpha, seasoned wolves, young ones, females, and pups varied distinctly. Participating in this communal singing strengthened the pack's unity, allowing even newcomers to feel part of something bigger. It was also a way to communicate and maintain relationships between packs sharing the same forest. It helped locate wounded or lost members, or invite the lone to join the pack. The chorus generally concluded with yapping, signifying the end of the message. As for the moon, it merely marked the agreed time for communication, creative expression, and tribal unity. Some humans who spent most of their lives alongside wolves developed a rare ability to understand and decipher wolf messages. Such people often became the best wolf hunters. A pack, excluding the many pups who, despite the attentive care of the pack, often didn't survive to adulthood, generally included no more than 12 adults. The leaders, a dominant male and female, led the pack, followed by their adult relatives. Seasoned pairs, unpaired wolves, newcomers, and younger wolves learning from the older ones. Wolves mated only once a year, and females allowed males near only during this season, yet preparations for such a significant event were made well in advance. Paired wolves protected each other from outsiders, and those without partners might engage in fierce fights, sometimes deadly. But in truth, it didn't always come to that. Instincts urged wolves to seek mates outside their birth pack, so wolves from the same litter usually did not mate. Naturally monogamous, a wolf and its mate would stay together for life unless one died. Forming a bond, they groomed each other, stayed close, and marked territory together. The male would mark over the female's scent, signaling to all that they were mates. When raising pups, whom the entire pack treated as their own, wolves might take shelter in caves, abandoned dens, or thickets. Only the females generally stayed close to the pups, while the males rarely approached the den. Possessing advanced strategic and tactical thinking, capable of making long-term plans, coordinating joint actions, and reacting instantly to changing circumstances, wolves knew how to organize elaborate ambushes. Sometimes part of the pack would stay hidden, while others drove prey toward them. The signal for an attack was always the low growl of the alpha. A clap of thunder sounded outside, and soon rain followed. Glancing occasionally at Hemingway's photograph, the werewolf finished the last of the canned beef with a large hunting knife that had a staghorn handle, then licked the can clean. He was about to open a new one when his gaze caught a stack of vinyl records. Setting the knife on the table, the uninvited guest stepped closer and picked one up. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Selected Works, read the label, accompanied by an image of a man with an unusually styled mane on his head. The werewolf had no idea what records were or what to do with them. But following a new instinct, he suppressed an urge to bite down on the edge of the record. He found himself strangely drawn to the name Wolfgang. He had his own name, of course, but he wasn't sure he could pronounce it in a human voice since it could no longer be read by scent. So it was decided he would be Wolfgang. Without fully understanding why, the werewolf approached the old phonograph and, placing the record on it, turned the crank. After a moment, the copper horn released sounds unfamiliar to one who knew every bird call and animal cry in his home forest. But this was something different. Beautiful. Intriguing. Enchanted, the werewolf stood there, losing track of time. Suddenly a voice startled him and he jerked back, glancing around to see if a person had crept up on him. It took him a moment to realize the voice was somehow coming from the copper horn itself. Human voices could sometimes be heard in the forest, people coming with their fires, tents, hunting and talking among themselves. But these sounds were unlike anything he'd heard before. German, Wolfgang thought, not fully understanding what the word meant. Just then the singer hit a high note, almost like he was signaling his pack. Without hesitation, the werewolf tried to join in with a long howl, but his new throat struggled, and it didn't come out well. The singer didn't react, though. Gradually realizing he was being ignored, he grew accustomed to the strange sounds and wandered around the room. Sitting on the edge of a couch, he discovered several books lying about. Taking one and turning it over, he opened it at random and began reading, surprised neither by what he was doing nor how he was doing it. The book told a story of a lone, unhappy wolf who, seemingly separated from his pack, stumbled upon humans. Initially, the story was pleasant enough. While the wolf devoured an old woman and her granddaughter, all was well. But the grim ending, with hunters arriving and abruptly spoiling the promising start, left the reader rather dissatisfied. On the other hand, he supposed it carried a valid moral. Don't mess with humans, even if a wolf naively believes he can hunt them without consequence. Finding this interpretation a reasonable justification for the tale, Wolfgang continued reading. The next story pleased him much more. In it, an unwise young human raised the alarm again and again until his whining was ignored, leaving him and an entire flock of sheep to be devoured by wolves. Despite the likely repercussions for the wolves, at least this tale ended on a positive note. Then came a fantastical story about 3 pigs who built houses to protect themselves from a wolf. Twice the wolf huffed and puffed and blew these flimsy defenses down with his mighty breath, a feat even the strongest pack leader would struggle to match. But he burst himself in the end, defeated by the 3rd, more fortified house. Finding neither truth nor beauty nor any sense, benefit, joy, or moral in this tale, the werewolf set the book aside in irritation and, clearing the unnecessary items from the couch, lay down to sleep. His mind wandered into unnecessary thoughts, why he was born, where he had come from, and where he was going. Questions that only disrupted his sleep. Years passed, and Wolfgang became a well-known politician, or leader as he called himself, heading a prominent political party, or pack, as he referred to it, recognized, among other things, as a fierce advocate for wildlife. The werewolf quickly found his place in the world of business and politics, scarcely losing any of the skills he had honed in his forest life. In essence, he simply adapted them to a new presentation. After all, it was basically the same. He still had to growl. He still had to bare his teeth. And if that wasn't enough, he would use them, rising above the pathetic weaklings with their empty threats and no real bite. He had to raise his voice, assert his right to lead, and put whining upstarts in their place. Even here, there were fleas of a sort. Pesky and often irritating with their constant bites, yet familiar and ultimately harmless. By different means, he marked his territory so that other business people and politicians wouldn't dare encroach on what he had already claimed. Meetings here were like gatherings back in the forest, where they would howl, growl, and whine, bringing up and discussing pressing issues. Yet Wolfgang was no pure egocentric. He looked after not only himself, but also the interests of his pack, from which he often expelled those who showed weakness, untrustworthiness, or inadequacy, and his electorate who trusted that his words would inevitably lead to actions. Forced aggression was for him not a thrill, but a necessary tool to maintain order and discipline among his own, and to defend their interests among outsiders. But it was not an end in itself. The werewolf knew not only how to punish, but also how to recognize and encourage, carefully supporting those who were valuable, important, and useful to his cause. Initially, he had presented himself as a reclusive, missing individual, the very werewolf who had foolishly bitten him and later paid dearly for it. He forged valuable connections within certain circles, created an identity for himself, and seamlessly integrated into human society. From there, he swiftly rallied like-minded individuals, taking control of both the legal and underground business of a provincial town, eventually becoming its unchallenged mayor. He then transformed his native forest into a nature reserve, immediately banning all forms of hunting there and simultaneously launching a program to restore the dwindling wolf population. Rumors spread in the town and surrounding areas, whispering that poachers who broke the law and escaped prosecution had a way of mysteriously disappearing. Yet even these remarkable successes didn't fully satisfy him. After spending time and resources laying the groundwork, he entered mainstream politics with long-term plans, continuing to organize, support, and fund initiatives that promoted our lesser kin, especially wolves. At the same time, he carefully ensured that allocated resources were used strictly for their intended purposes. Hunting societies, taxidermy shops, and museums with animal exhibits quickly fell out of Wolfgang's favor. Officially, their professional activities were hampered through bureaucratic means, protests, and the passing of various legislative amendments. Unofficially, however, their offices were trashed, their homes set ablaze, and their representatives were persuaded to abandon their pursuits, or they simply vanished without a trace. By uniting activist groups across the globe, Wolfgang laid the groundwork for the creation of an international animal rights convention, designed to provide animals with inalienable rights, modeled closely after the International Convention on Human Rights. Wolfgang was not indifferent to matters of culture, science, and art either. For instance, a bronze statuette of the she-wolf who raised Romulus and Remus held a prominent spot on his office desk, and his favorite saying was the Latin phrase, "Homine homini lupus." Estimated his personal gallery included numerous paintings focused on forests, particularly depicting wolves, while the shelves in his library were filled with scientific research volumes on wildlife and literary works portraying wolves not as bloodthirsty villains, but as noble and valiant beings, living by their own code of honor. He held particular respect for Rudyard Kipling, especially the figure of Aquila, the wise and noble wolf leader Kipling had crafted. After acquiring several private nature television channels and a few prominent publishing houses, he set out to encourage the creation of films and shows where wolves were always depicted in a positive light. This obsession, of course, did not go unnoticed by the press, the public, or his detractors, but it was entirely understandable. Wolfgang had prepared for this well in advance, securing a doctoral degree in natural sciences. His groundbreaking monographs, masterpieces that illuminated the intricacies of the wild, particularly the lives of wolves, in nuances no other scientist had touched, created a sensation in the scientific world. By showing the world that living among wolves did not mean howling with them, and that even the most dangerous predator could be a loyal friend if one knew how to find common ground, Wolfgang kept an entire pack on his private reserve. This pack included an aging she-wolf, her grown offspring, and her grandchildren. Because no matter how often folklore painted wolves as treacherous or deceitful, Wolfgang understood a truth that guided him deeply. A wolf pair was forever. He drove down the winding road, windows down, inhaling the thick scent of pine and earth, soaked from the recent rain. The wind's roar, bursting into his old van, was louder than his own thoughts, but he didn't mind. That sound, the rustling leaves, the gusts, the wheels grinding the road's dust, swept away the last traces of his reason, that clear, familiar control he'd once thought inherent. With each new place, with each new road, his clarity had faded more and more. He understood he was becoming something that didn't feel at home anywhere, without family or close ties, retreating each day further into the shadows of his own nature, dissolving into the forest he wandered. Years ago, he had thought life on the road would mean freedom. He'd seen it through romantic lenses, the image of a mysterious traveler, a wandering werewolf moving from town to town, hiding in the shadows. But reality turned out differently. His world had shrunk to the size of his rusty van, to a tiny bed with a worn blanket and dusty books on the floor. Looking at himself in the grimy mirror, he saw a creature that only outwardly resembled a man, but had long since lost any human essence within. He remained something in between, but that middle ground had become an emptiness. Old questions replayed in his mind, over and over. Why had this happened? Why him? Why did a man have to bear this curse, this power he hadn't asked for, yet one that had utterly transformed his life? He often thought about how he might have lived differently. Living like those who returned home every evening, only to go back to work the next morning, knowing what tomorrow and the day after would bring. That steady routine seemed something distant and impossible. All paths backward were closed, yet the future offered him no clarity either. He knew that if he stayed in one place for too long, he'd begin to raise suspicions again. Loneliness had become his only companion, his inevitable companion, bringing him both peace and anguish. He once believed that by setting out, he'd find himself. But with every mile traveled, with each new stop, he realized it was just a chase after shadows, the ghost of a life he'd lost. He'd long since stopped thinking about what he'd like to change. His life had lost all meaning, and he moved forward out of inertia because staying still held no purpose. Standing still was, to him, the same as accepting defeat. Moving from town to town, working temporary, unnoticed jobs, he had learned to blend into the crowd, going unnoticed. People ceased to mean anything to him. He glimpsed at them as if they were elements of the landscape, like trees or stones. Their faces, their voices, their troubles, all of it seemed distant and meaningless. To him, they were like relentless, pointless waves crashing against the shore. He felt neither guilt for his actions nor regret. Human fates no longer concerned him, and even when he looked at children, he felt no attachment or warmth. But every night, left alone in the dark with his own thoughts, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had fallen. His life had become an existence on the edge. It held no purpose, no meaning. He felt like a predator, unable to return to being human, yet not fully a beast. In this in-between state, he'd found both freedom and a curse. He was bound to his instincts, but they brought him no joy. His nature demanded the hunt, demanded violence, but he saw no meaning in it anymore. He often tried to find an explanation for what had happened to his soul, where, deep within, had he lost something vital? Perhaps it happened long ago, on one of those rare days when he'd still been an ordinary man. Or maybe this was an inevitable part of his path, leading him into the darkness in which he now lived. Every choice, every decision had been his own. He didn't blame fate or his curse. He knew he'd become this way himself. But even in this darkness, there was a trace of light, those rare moments when he could look in the mirror and see something human, something that still held on in his eyes. He knew this feeling, a longing for what was lost, would stay with him forever. It would gnaw at his soul, but at the same time it wouldn't let him forget who he'd been. Was there any solace in that? Probably not. But it reminded him of his path, of what he'd become, and why he could never go back. These thoughts stretched like an endless thread. Sometimes he tried to silence them, filling his mind with the night's stillness. He listened to the wind, the rustle of grass, the creak of old trees, and thought about how nature lived without questions, and only humans asked them of themselves. Only humans looked to the future, hoping to find answers there, and only they felt the pain of an answer's absence. He thought that if he could become an ordinary man again, he wouldn't feel this torment. Ordinary people live without pondering what life is, why it's given to them, or what its ultimate purpose is. But he had a different nature that forced him to search, to dig into his own consciousness, to feel pangs over not being able to hold on to his human face. He was cursed with the awareness of his weaknesses and vices, which had led him down this path. And so he wandered alone, knowing he would never find peace, but still trying to reach for it. Thus, night after night, he roamed the roads from one small town to the next, not knowing if he would ever find an answer. But despite this, a faint hope still flickered in his heart, that one day he might find peace, even if it was on his final journey. He'd always felt that nature, the forest, the animals, were somehow alien to his human essence. He watched a world that seemed isolated, self-contained, governed by its own laws, with no place for morals or attachments. This forest, where his nomadic life had led him, stretched far beyond the horizon, with each of its corners living by its own immutable rules. Nature stood above all boundaries that people carefully drew on maps and fenced off with walls. Here, far from the cities, its essence was revealed to him. Wild, relentless, devoid of sentimentality. He looked at the forest and understood. To the animals, his presence was just another part of the natural order, another inhabitant, a stranger who bore the scent of danger. But for him, a werewolf, it was more than a habitat. It was a new home, though he felt no attachment or reverence toward it. He knew he was a foreigner to the forest, and it didn't bother him. Rather, he enjoyed being able to live there, feeling no reverence. The forest wasn't sacred ground, but a place to hide and dominate its inhabitants. He didn't need reasons to treat nature as a tool. He felt he was as much a creature as any animal here, but with the difference that he possessed reason and will, allowing him to subdue and change the world. Perhaps it was this very attitude that separated him from a simple wolf. To him, nature was not a shrine, but a means, a source of food and shelter, and he saw nothing wrong with that. He understood that others, less seasoned werewolves, avoided attacking animals or humans, trying not to leave any traces to avoid arousing hate and suspicion. But he, as a skilled hunter, saw no need for such caution. He knew that nature had no mercy, and thus neither should he. Every new animal that fell into his traps reminded him of how isolated he had become from the world around him. He didn't feel pity for them, nor did he revel in any bloodthirsty satisfaction. Hunting had become a routine for him, a necessity like breakfast or dinner. A fox that happened to cross his path or a careless deer. He regarded them not as unique creatures, but as part of an endless stream of life that could be interrupted at any moment. He knew animals lived and died, and to him there was no tragedy in it, as their fate was defined by their nature. And in that, there was an order he trusted. Yet sometimes he found himself wondering, what if he was no different from those he hunted? A beast, a predator, a wanderer. Maybe he too was merely a temporary inhabitant, a passing element of this world. His life, like that of any animal, could end at any moment. He understood that all living things were doomed to die, and this realization didn't frighten him in the slightest. Perhaps this very thought granted him inner freedom, allowing him to live without fear of the future. In the forest, he felt an odd sense of peace. He didn't have to answer for his actions to anyone, didn't have to pretend to be someone else. Here among the trees and silence, he could simply be himself. He felt like he owned the place, not because he was attached to it or felt compassion for those who lived there, but because he felt no need for such connections. Perhaps it was cynicism, but he believed that in this world, strength mattered most. Strength allowed him to survive, and he knew it was what gave him the right to exist in this wild forest. He didn't consider himself ruthless, as many might assume. Rather, he saw his outlook as a logical consequence of the path his life had taken. Human laws, human attachments, all that was long behind him, remnants of a life that no longer belonged to him. Now he was a creature that answered only to his own instincts. Every step he took, every move he made stemmed from the inner nature he had embraced and come to understand. Strength, determination, survival. These were the three pillars defining his existence. He saw himself as a being above his kin, above those who had once walked alongside him, and above the humans he only saw in the context of his hunts. He took pride in the fact that he could stay in the forest, keeping his mind, his strength, and his cunning, which allowed him to endure. Humans, with their love for nature, seemed strange and incomprehensible to him. They praised nature, yet destroyed it for their own convenience. He considered them weaker than himself because they sought something beautiful and pure in the world while he viewed it through the lens of survival. He felt no attachment to nature, yet no need to destroy it as humans did. His philosophy was simple. Everyone should survive as nature dictates, expecting neither mercy nor forgiveness from it. Still, he sometimes felt a strange sensation, a blend of loneliness and detachment, as though his existence lacked meaning. He understood he hadn't become a werewolf by choice, but because life had placed this trial before him. He was one of the few who had come to terms with his power and learned to use it. But at the same time, he knew this path had led him to loneliness, stripping him of the bonds and relationships that might have given his life meaning. For him, the forest was merely a temporary refuge, a place where he could find food and hide from human eyes. He knew he'd leave it one day to move on, and perhaps he would never return, leaving behind only traces of his hunting paths. In his eyes, the forest wasn't an endless territory of freedom, but merely a stop along the way. He knew he'd eventually leave, leaving only emptiness in his wake. His van had become his only constant, though even calling it a home felt strange to him. He didn't know what it meant to have a home, not in the full sense of the word. Once, he'd had a home, familiar rooms, familiar smells and sounds, a familiar view from the window, but that was a distant memory. Now his world was a metal box on wheels, layered with the sense of decades past, dust settling in every crevice, with parts broken and repaired over the years. He viewed this space as temporary shelter, but he understood that there was nothing temporary about it. It had become a part of him, a vessel for his insatiable urge to wander. Every morning he awoke in a new place, looking out at the forest through the window, hearing bird song, or conversely, an unsettling silence. And in this constant change, he found a peculiar kind of peace. The forest, the trees, the stones, the trails, they all changed but remained strangely constant. This granted him a sense of stability that he'd lost long ago among humans. It seemed to him that with every mile, with every curve in the road, he drifted not only away from people but from something within himself that had once been his human soul. Once he had been someone who lived among people, but that time had passed and now he could scarcely recall what it was like to be human. He lacked the words to describe his new existence because the beast within him had no need for them. He, like the forest, was silent, and this silence spoke of his new life more than words ever could. In it was both pain and peace, and an inevitability. He knew there would be no going back, and this understanding brought him a strange sense of relief. Life among humans had always come with so many conditions, rules, and restrictions, which he now saw as imposed, artificial. In his real life, the life of a werewolf, there were no such chains. He could go anywhere, do anything, live by his own rules. Now he no longer feared animals, nor did he fear the forest. He felt within himself the same untamed freedom that was part of this world, and this freedom allowed him to view life more simply, unburdened by needless questions. One day, waking up at dawn, he stepped out of the van and felt the forest's cold morning breath. The air was filled with the scent of life and death, and he felt himself part of it. He knew that with every new day the beast within him awoke more powerfully, demanding his full commitment. This strength, growing with each dawn, was not just instinct. It was his new essence, a new life philosophy he had accepted and no longer intended to deny. He no longer had to choose between the life of a man and that of a beast. He knew he had become a creature living by his own laws, and in this was his truth. He was fully aware that for him, former human attachments held no meaning or purpose. People saw something significant in the world, attempted to make sense of it, justify their lives, seek some lofty purpose, whereas for him everything had become fundamentally simple. His life had been reduced to finding food, surviving, and moving forward. Unlike people, he felt no need to change that. Yet even so, he understood that his existence was more than just instincts. He couldn't rid himself of the desire to comprehend, to make sense of his actions, his fate, even though he knew such understanding might never come. It seemed to him that no single answer existed for the question of his purpose. He knew only one thing. Every day he lived, every movement, every action served some higher purpose that he had yet to grasp, yet one that inevitably urged him onward. He saw his existence as an endless journey, a road without end. He didn't need recognition, approval, or understanding from others. He sought only his place in this world, not among people, but among beasts within the forest, among those who lived by laws he had chosen to accept. He understood that this path was fraught with dangers, but his nature, his very being, would not allow him to stray from it. Every day, every night, every morning, he looked at the forest before him and felt that here, among the shadows and trees, he had finally found what he was searching for. Perhaps it wasn't an answer, but it was peace, something he no longer sought among people. And in that peace, in that silence, in that solitude, he felt alive. It was a strange, dark feeling, but it gave him joy, if only for a while, if only for one more day. Still, no matter how he craved the silence of the forest, a shadow lingered within him, something he couldn't forget, that continued to haunt him. This shadow, this echo of old memories of people, of who he once was, refused to let him rest. He understood that this part of him would never disappear, no matter how hard he tried to forget it. It would always remain, a dark reminder that his path was not only the life of a werewolf, but also the journey of a lost man still searching for himself. One day, he caught himself thinking that in this solitude, he was gaining freedom but losing something essential. He could no longer understand what exactly he had lost, but he sensed that it was something meaningful. He knew he could never go back, yet this knowledge brought neither pain nor fear. He had become a creature that had lost its sense of purpose, but had found freedom. And that freedom seemed enough to keep him going. So another day passed. Wandering along secluded forest trails, he would sometimes pause, listening to the rustling around him. The forest was more than just his surroundings. It had become a part of him, a silent companion, his refuge, and his place of strength. Here he was free from prejudice, unbound by the conventions of the human world. Yet even this freedom carried a cold loneliness. Sometimes he felt as though he was becoming a shadow of the forest, something invisible, present within it, but beyond its laws. The longer he remained in this state, the farther he drifted from any signs of his past, from what had once tied him to humanity. Here, among the towering pines and tangled bushes, he had found a way of existence that allowed him to hunt, to breathe deeply without thinking of people or their problems. The forest had become part of a singular whole for him, a place where he saw nothing but the essentials: flesh, bone, wood, blood. The forest wasn't a place of rest or an object for contemplation. It was a universe governed by survival and struggle. He sought no comfort here, no place of seclusion. Every step he took, every breath he drew adhered to the unyielding laws of nature. He learned from the forest, absorbing its strength, its patience, and its silent perseverance. Hidden among the trees, he imbibed their cold calm, and his consciousness became part of something far older than human customs and fears. He stopped asking questions, allowing the forest's silence to become his guide. The trees, these giants stretching toward the sky, grew year after year, dying and reviving. And in this, he found a model of resilience he sought to emulate. Though the forest offered him no answers, he felt its power. Gradually, the forest became not just a refuge, but a new reality. He saw no reason to return to people, no need to search for lost memories. He was here, and that was enough. His existence merged with this wild, primal environment. And he understood that his essence was no longer tied to those memories that had once tormented him. In the forest, he found peace, and that peace, devoid of words and thoughts, felt truer to him than any of the answers he had sought in his former life. But one day, as he moved through the undergrowth as usual, tracking a deer's trail, the forest seemed to change. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to another shadow, an unfamiliar scent cutting through the air. Something in this presence was foreign, yet at the same time, it stirred something within him. Some creature, solitary, a stranger in the forest like himself, had somehow crossed into his territory, leaving traces that only an experienced hunter would notice. it was a premonition, a sense that this encounter could change something. He felt a strength and determination that hadn't been so alive within him for a long time. He thought that this unknown creature was closer than he allowed himself to believe, but the forest held its mystery until the right moment arrived. One day passed, then a second, and the strange scent left by the unknown presence lingered. With every step he felt it, sometimes sharp, sometimes barely perceptible, hidden behind the scents of damp leaves and earth. This wasn't the simple scent of an animal. It held an otherness, an ominous mystery that kept gnawing at him. It was a reminder of something different, perhaps forgotten or lost. Yet it aroused a feeling not just of threat, but something more, as though he was on the brink of a meeting he had been preparing for his entire life without even knowing it. With each step, he approached the place where the scent grew stronger. The forest around him seemed restless, as if it instinctively avoided the stranger. The forest rarely accepted anyone lightly, and if this was a true beast, it must have been powerful to leave such an imprint on its canopy. His very nature demanded that he find this creature, to know what lay behind it. Yet with every step, he sensed more that this encounter would be more than just a confrontation between two predators. On the third day, he finally discovered the tracks. Fresh, clear, but there was something strange about them, even unsettling. The tracks on the damp earth felt familiar, yet held an elusive trace of humanity, as though this beast belonged to two worlds at once. And then, as if awakened by ancient instincts, he felt a faint but distinct sensation, a feeling that emanated from the tracks and filled his mind. It was a premonition of threat and fear, a primal, foreign feeling he had long forgotten. He moved forward cautiously, sensing the air around him growing thicker. In this part of the forest, everything had fallen silent. The sounds had vanished, as if the world itself were holding its breath. And then, he saw it. At first it was just a shadow flitting between the trees, but then from the darkness the figure of a wolf emerged. Large, powerful, with eyes that shone with cold fury. This wolf, like himself, appeared to be a stranger, yet it was something more than just a beast. They stood still, staring at each other like ancient foes, ready for an inevitable clash. Yet in that silence, there was neither brutality nor fear. This was a confrontation of two worlds, two forces that could no longer avoid each other. The wolf watched him, unblinking, never looking away, and the werewolf realized that this was no ordinary creature but something as ancient as the forest itself, something that had been waiting for him there for a long time. In that moment he understood that this encounter would change him. Their eyes met, and it felt as though this silent standoff stretched into eternity. This was no mere predator, no mere beast. In those eyes, bright and penetrating as midnight in those cautious, almost conscious movements, he saw a reflection of himself, of his very essence. Gazing into the wolf's eyes, it was as if he were looking into a mirror, revealing something that had been hidden from him for so long. He was not alone in this forest. He was not the only one who had come here with a shadow within, carrying the weight of two worlds. This encounter was more than just physical. It was a moment that transformed the werewolf's inner world. It seemed to him that this wolf knew everything about his nature, all his suffering, the struggle between beast and man that had long tormented him. And yet, the wolf remained utterly calm. Its gaze was direct and unflinching, filled with certainty, as though the werewolf was nothing more than a passer-by, with no right to be here. The werewolf knew that the wolf could attack at any moment, but there was no fear or malice in its eyes, only a profound understanding. The werewolf felt his own anger, a cold rage, begin to rise, as the animal instinct within him suppressed what remained of his reason, pushing him toward an impulsive action. He no longer saw the wolf as an animal. It was an opponent that had to be conquered, subdued. He felt the power and strength in his body growing, each muscle tensing with the promise of a deadly strike. But the wolf remained still. It stood unmoving, yet full of strength, watching him, as if trying to understand the source of this decision, this blinding rage. And then, in a fleeting moment, the werewolf realized that this wasn't a clash between beast and beast. This was his own challenge, a confrontation with himself. A sudden awareness filled his mind. This wolf, this symbol of strength and freedom, was not his enemy. It was here to show him the true nature of his existence. The werewolf knew that this sense of power and anger needed release, yet he suddenly felt powerless before this creature. And then, in a moment of weakness, he stepped forward. He moved closer to the wolf, yet it did not retreat, and this stirred within him a strange sense of respect. It seemed to him that he could no longer stop. This encounter had to reach its inevitable conclusion. He couldn't hold back and lunged forward, jaws snapping, but at that moment, the wolf struck. He felt sharp teeth pierce his neck, felt the wolf's grip tighten, yet it did not relent. Their battle was silent and fierce, as primal as the night itself. Two beings bound together by a force neither fully understood. The pain from the wolf's bite pierced him like an icy blade. Yet in that instant, there was a glimpse of something else. Not just physical defeat, but a sense of loss. It was as though the bite had absorbed all his delusions, his false strength, all the illusions he'd clung to for so long. He watched as the wolf vanished into the shadows of the trees, leaving him alone. But the silence it left behind offered no peace. The pain of the bite subsided, but in its place a new weight settled. The realization that he was no longer needed here. His own body, now almost entirely drained of strength, felt foreign and unnecessary, and the power that had once been so great now slipped away, like sand through his fingers. But this was only the beginning. Suddenly, he felt a new wave of weakness, as if the wolf had taken something more than his life. Everything that had once given him strength in his former existence, his animal fury, his urge to dominate, his boundless freedom was gone, leaving only painful memories and emptiness. In the forest, he had always thought of himself as a master, believing he could use this world for his own ends. But now he realized it had all been an illusion. His strength was leaving him, and he understood that he could not return to his old life, that this was his final hour. And in that moment, as the last flickers of consciousness faded, he thought of the wolf. The one who now knew his weaknesses was more than just a beast. This creature, who had turned his defeat into its own victory, understood him more than anyone else ever had. He glimpsed the realization that the wolf had not only survived, but had used this encounter to take his place. A final breath slipped from his lips, and he sank into darkness, surrendering himself to the forest, which accepted him as prey, as an unnecessary link in a chain that would no longer continue. Thus ended the journey of the werewolf who had foolishly taken the wolf for mere prey. As the wolf departed, it did not look back, certain that its victory was absolute. The curse that this man had once inflicted upon it had now become its strength, its new beginning. It already knew how to use the werewolf's identity and papers, knew it could seamlessly assume his place in society, remaining to others only a reclusive, strange figure whom no one would suspect. At first, it had to study the werewolf's life, his habits and routines. But gradually, like in the hunt, it came to understand the laws of human society better and better. Soon it became known as a protector of nature, whose knowledge of forests and wild animals was remarkably precise. This new world was a different environment, but it felt that it could find its place here, continuing to serve the wolfkin and the laws of nature, which had always been its highest truth. The werewolf who had once dared to bite it was now only a shadow, and the wolf, having assumed his form, had become one who could not only survive in this world, but also protect the forest and all who lived within it.